Mahler was born in 1860 in what is now the Czech Republic in a tiny town called Kalisz, population 300. His father was an innkeeper and a distiller. He made brandy, Bernhard Mahler. And his mother, Marie, bore Bernhard 14 children. Only 6 of these children survived to adulthood. It's not so unusual at that time. But Mahler was actually Mahler had an older brother, Isidor, who was dead before Mahler was even born. But Mahler witnessed the death of 7 of these children at varying ages, and it definitely shaped the person that he was. When Mahler was 3 or 4, he had his first musical experience, which is his grandparents had an accordion, and he figured out how to play tunes on this accordion. And when he was 5 or maybe 6, his mother said, for a couple of crowns, if you'll write some piano music, I'll give you this money. And Mahler came to her and he said, I've written the pieces. It's called Polka, an Introductory Funeral March. Immediately, you can tell the kind of person that Mahler was. Obviously, he was a great composer, the kind of mind that absorbed music rapidly and learned to play the piano amazingly, actually. By the time he was 9, he was giving piano lessons in this. Actually, they moved from the tiny town of Kalisz to a town of Iglau, which compared to Kalisz was pretty big. But by the time Mahler was 10 and had given his first public piano recital, his father thought he should send him to Prague, to a gymnasium, to a junior high school, where he could have more exposure to great music and all the things that a big city has to offer. Unfortunately for Mahler, the living conditions in the boarding house where he went in Prague were dismal, and apparently the woman who ran the place hated him and never fed him. And after 6 months, he went home to Iglau. So somebody asked him after his experience in Prague, when he was 11 years old now, what he wanted to be when he grew up, and he said, I'm going to be a martyr. The personality of this extraordinary man is already clear at an early age. Now, unfortunately, Mahler's parents were not getting along. Financially, they were very strapped, and more children were dying than living. And Mahler's father beat Mahler's mother, and Mahler witnessed this frequently. So, terrible childhood. His dearest friend was his younger brother, Ernst. And Ernst was 13 when he came down with a very serious disease. Mahler, who was 14, stayed by his bedside for months and told him stories and felt that it was his personal responsibility to pull Ernst through this, and of course he didn't, and Ernst died, and Mahler felt that it was his fault. So finally, Mahler gets away from all of this. At age 15, he is accepted at the Vienna Conservatory. So he goes to Vienna, and of course Vienna in the latter part of the 19th century was a great place to be. It was the intellectual center and the artistic center, or one of them anyway, of Central Europe. So suddenly Mahler is surrounded by great music and great musicians, and art and literature and philosophy. So he begins to read Schopenhauer, and he begins to read Nietzsche, and his world is opened up. Well, as a student at the conservatory, his friend, Hugo Wolf, born in the same year and went to the Vienna Conservatory in the same year, and he explored musical Vienna. And of course, Hugo Wolf turned into a terrific composer himself. But he and Mahler were very different. Wolf was very slow, and Mahler was an agile, healthy young man. So every time Wolf had an idea, like maybe I should take this story and turn it into an opera. Mahler would come around 2 hours later and he'd already, written the whole libretto. So he and Wolf sort of had a falling out, but they went back and forth. The next year they went together, Wolf and Mahler, to hear a premiere of the Third Symphony by Anton Bruckner. Now Bruckner was 35 years older than the two of them, but Mahler and Wolf were the only two people in the Künstlerhaus that liked this symphony. The rest of the audience screamed, just booed poor old Bruckner off the stage. And so Mahler and Wolf went backstage and congratulated Bruckner, and Bruckner just became their friend. He didn't try to be a teacher, but they would spend time together. They would go to coffee houses, which is what you do most of the time in Vienna. You go to coffee houses and you discuss art. And so they had this great relationship. And so Mahler and another friend, Rudolf Krasnivitsky, decided they would, as a gift to Bruckner, write a four-hand piano version of his Third Symphony. And he was so touched by this because the public had rejected it. And now a couple of teenagers, who were, of course, extraordinary teenagers, had turned it into a piano duet. Now, this was particularly important in the 1870s because symphonies, especially gigantic symphonies, didn't get performed very often. The only way that the general public and the large emerging middle-class public that owned pianos got to know pieces was because the publishing houses would come out with these marvelous four-hand versions so you could play the symphonies at home. And this is the way that not only the later 19th century symphonies, but the earlier ones too, came to be better known. You couldn't have Beethoven symphonies every night, but you could play the duet versions every night. And every big publishing house in Vienna had their own versions of these pieces. So Mahler is at conservatory, and he now decides he's going to write something more significant. So he delves into German folklore, and he finds the story of two brothers. One murders the other. The brother who is the murderer gets married. The troubadour at the wedding digs up a bone from under a tree, which just happens to be the bone of the murdered brother. And so when he hollows the bone out and plays it as a flute, it sings to all the wedding guests that the brother has murdered his brother. It's such a great Mahler story, right? What else could he have been drawn to? And he called the whole thing Das klagende Lied, the sorrowful song, the complaining song. And so Das klagende Lied was a gigantic, not opera, but let's call it an oratorio in three parts. Mahler revised it considerably, and even today you can occasionally hear a performance of Das klagende Lied. So this was really Mahler's first important work. He was drawn to the voice, but interestingly not really drawn to opera. And I thought about this a lot because for example, Puccini was born just 2 years before Mahler. Obviously, Puccini had such a sense of the theater. Mahler had a very strong sense of the theatrical and the dramatic, but not really a sense of the theater because, I think, when Mahler expresses an opinion musically, he doesn't wait for somebody else to answer. And I'm not saying that to be negative about Mahler. But when he states an idea, he likes to state it in a very long way. And successful drama usually depends on one character having an opinion or a feeling, and then, before too long, another character coming back with a conflicting opinion or feeling, or else maybe joining them. But in Mahler, we feel that it's always Mahler explaining Mahler. And again, I'm not trying to be critical, but Mahler, for, as I say, half a century, suffered a kind of neglect because I think people were not prepared for this very different kind of expression. Yes, they had heard the operas of Wagner, which were gigantic and long, but nevertheless, a drama in which many characters voiced many opinions. And so Mahler, who was a great lover of Wagner, never had the feeling of something that went back and forth. All right, so Mahler leaves conservatory, and his father encourages him not just to be a musician, but to go to the University of Vienna and study literature and philosophy. And Mahler does this. He skips a lot of his classes, but he's exposed, nevertheless, to a wider range of the intellectual, vibrant life of Vienna. And Anton Bruckner is teaching at the university. So although Mahler never takes a class from him, they take a lot of long walks together and they go to concerts together. And so Mahler is deeply fed by the older composer and has a great admiration for his works. If you were to say who were the three composers that most influenced Wagner, it would be fair to say Bruckner, that most influenced Mahler. It would be Bruckner, Wagner, and Beethoven. Interestingly, you've probably guessed by now that Mahler was a narcissist and felt that everything that went through his head was important for everyone else to hear. Now, sometimes in a composer, that's a very valuable characteristic. And looking back, you could say that Beethoven and Wagner shared that characteristic. They felt that their subjective feelings about the world and everything around them were important enough to merit silencing everything else around them. Bruckner, on the other hand, was one of the most self-effacing, humble people, and really to his own detriment. Because although everybody acknowledged that he was the greatest organist alive, and they would come from miles away to hear him play at his church in Linz, his symphonies never have the element of exhibitionism, which are an important part of what makes a composition live in people's minds. Whereas you can think of so many examples in Beethoven and Wagner and Mahler where the composer stops everything to say, here I am, and you're going to listen to it. And really, that survival instinct is what makes extroverted great composers live longer in a way than at least poor old Bruckner, who has fallen into such neglect now, even though there are masterpieces, many masterpieces that Bruckner wrote. So Mahler doesn't have this problem. He feels that he has a subjective worldview which is different from everyone else's, and in fact can heal the world and needs to be heard. So his first means of expression, as I say, is vocal, and he writes several songs. Suddenly, love crosses his threshold for the first time, this in the form of a postmaster's daughter named Josefina Poisel. And for Josefina, he writes a song called Mai-Tanz im Grünen, which means May dance in the green, in the forest. So this dance uses a very characteristic peasant dance form, which we know as Ländler, a dance that comes from the land, that belongs to the peasants. Of course, already in the 1870s in Vienna, Mahler would have been hearing waltzes, which were a more upper-class, sophisticated dance, and developed in Vienna to the highest form. But he wanted to return to his Czech roots and use this Ländler dance as an expression in this love song for Josefina. So Mahler, even though he's developed his musical sensibilities and his wonderful compositional abilities, feels like he's still an outsider in Vienna. He's still a peasant, he's still a bohemian, and he's Jewish. And of course, 1875, when Mahler came to Vienna, anti-Semitism was rife. Nothing changed. The huge stock market crash in Austria came in 1873. So Jews were vilified as being responsible for this stock market crash, and Wagner was as vehement as anybody in his racist sentiments. So although Mahler was not particularly religious, he was very aware that he was an outsider, and he often wrote, "I am 3 times an outsider." So this of course, goes along with his feeling that he was going to grow up to be a martyr. So here Wagner influences Mahler, and Mahler loves his music, but there can never be a connection between these men. However, Mahler realizes that he has another great talent, not just his composition and his piano playing, but he needs to make some money. And he goes to the spa town of Bad Hall when he's 20, and he gets a gig conducting operetta. Now, the serious-minded Mahler and fluffy Austrian operetta may seem like strange bedfellows to you, but Mahler distinguished himself within months of being a superb conductor, not just an excellent conductor. However, his standards had never been imposed before on singers or orchestras. And I don't mean just at Bad Hall, I mean anywhere. So poor Bad Hall didn't know what hit them. Suddenly Mahler is demanding 30 rehearsals so that every singer's diction is perfect and every instrumentalist's playing is perfect. And I assure you that 130 years ago, the standard of orchestral playing, especially in a German spa town, was not really high. So soon, news of this young taskmaster, Gustav Mahler, spread. And he was offered other engagements to conduct in Laibach and in Olmütz and in other places where he really didn't want to be, but that's all he could get as a 20-year-old, 22-year-old conductor. However, he got his first break, and he was hired to be the music director in Kassel, a much larger opera house where he got to conduct things like Il Trovatore and substantial works. Well, Mahler had a feeling, this won't surprise you, that while many others had attempted these works, he was the first person that had any idea how they should be handled. And while, unfortunately, there is no recorded record of Mahler's conducting, apparently he was truly one of the greatest conductors who has ever lived. One of his disciples was Otto Klemperer, a terrific conductor himself, who said, "The greatest conductor of my generation was Arturo Toscanini, but in the generation before, Mahler was 100 times better than him." He said, it was extraordinary. Mahler was quite small. He was maybe 5'4", and jumped all over the place. And somehow, through force of will and making his emotions known, was able to get a gigantic symphony orchestra to go completely along with him. Plus, they were all afraid of him because he had quite a temper. But apparently also could be very inspirational. So, Mahler is now starting to work at better opera houses and turns out to be quite a crafty administrator. He's able to deal with rivaling factions, he has seemingly inexhaustible energy, and once he's in the position to do so, finds works from France and Italy that have never been done in German-speaking countries before and brings them, such as the hitherto unknown opera by Bizet called Carmen. So he does the German language premiere of Carmen, and he does the German language premiere of Massenet's Manon. And later on, a few years later, he discovers this unknown Italian opera called Cavalleria Rusticana, and he brings it all to Germany or Austria or wherever he happens to be. So from Kassel, he moves to Leipzig. And suddenly, good orchestras and good singers are available to him. So, Brahms comes to hear him perform, and Tchaikovsky comes to hear him perform, and they think this Mahler is quite extraordinary. Well, about this time, he has interest in a young woman named Mathilde von Weber. How can he get closer to Mathilde von Weber? Well, it turns out Mathilde's husband is named Karl von Weber. And Karl is the grandson of the composer Karl Maria von Weber, who wrote some terrific operas, as you know. like Der Freischütz, which Mahler loved and conducted, and others as well. But he left an unfinished opera called Die Drei Pintos, a comic opera set in Spain. Mahler proposes to von Weber's grandson that he will flesh out this opera so that it can be performed. He doesn't mention anything about the connection with his wife. So Mahler takes other music that Weber wrote. He doesn't use any of his own music. And he turns a wind quintet or a string quartet into an operatic number. And pretty soon, he has figured out how to make Die Drei Pintos into a whole opera. And he decides that he's going to perform the whole thing at Leipzig. And Leipzig loves this new opera by Carl Maria von Weber. And Mahler contacts Matilda and says, I'm going to be on the next train out of town, and I want you to meet me on the train, and we're going to go away. You're going to leave your husband and your 3 children. And, she does not do this. So Mahler goes home, again, this will hardly surprise you, and arranges hundreds of candles around his bed, and with no audience, stages his own funeral. And he lies in his bed pretending to be dead, hoping that sooner or later Matilda will come by to see how he's doing, which she does. So she finds him laid out on this self-styled bier, and they rekindle their relationship briefly. But what really comes out of this is that it inspires him, or at least so he tells us, to write a symphonic movement. And this is Mahler's first great symphonic movement. Now, as it turns out, this movement becomes the first movement of his second symphony. So he puts that aside. But the first movement of the second symphony, called Totenfeier, Rites of the Dead, was inspired by his theatrical performance for himself and for his mistress, Matilda von Weber. So all of this Wagner music Mahler music is inspired by events in his life. Mahler realized that because his music was so autobiographical that he was open to criticism. So he hastened to tell the general public that while it was always possible to find programmatic elements in anybody's music, that all his music did was capture the spiritual essence of these different situations, not actually replicate it literally. So he really wanted to distance himself from the idea that he was writing program music. And you know what I mean when I say program music, right? Music that actually tells a story, like in Beethoven's Pastoral Symphony, there's a part that is the peasants dancing, and then there's a storm, or in Berlioz's Symphonie Fantastique, when there's a ball and then there's a witch's Sabbath. Mahler wanted to avoid a direct storytelling in his music. He felt that was somehow less than music that was absolute music. Now, about this time, Mahler discovers a soprano at the Leipzig Opera House. And her name is Anna von Mildenberg. And he and Anna strike up an affair, and Anna is not married. That's a good thing. So Anna von Mildenberg is the inspiration for a number of songs. And these songs are kind of like Schubert's Die Schöne Müllerin, in that they follow a love affair through happiness, unhappiness, and finally separation and tragedy. Mahler's first song is When My Love Gets Married. Wenn mein Lieb Hochzeit macht. Right, I knew I had to play a musical example. So to us now, that doesn't sound very modern, but this is actually 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2. So he makes a giant triplet in the second bar. Mahler is already playing with rhythmic ambiguity in the 1880s in a way that other composers had not done. Now, I read this, I don't know if it's true, but Mahler's mother was lame and walked with a limp all of her life. And everybody that knew Mahler said, although he was perfectly healthy, that he always walked with a sympathetic limp. And it occurred to me that, a person who walks with both legs equally healthy tends to think in 4/4 time. But a person, indulge me, it's a theory. A person who has a slight limp might naturally think 4/3, 4/3. And this does indeed happen frequently in Mahler's music. So I can't prove it, but I'm just laying the case out before you, all right. So, the next song in this song cycle called Lieder eines fahrenden Gesellen, which means song of a journeying wayfarer. Actually, usually we call it songs of a wayfarer is the typical translation. The second song is the happy one, and it begins with Mahler's favorite interval, which is the descending fourth. It's a song about how beautiful nature is. He says, this morning I went out over the field and the finch was so happy to see me. He said, "Hey you, isn't it a beautiful world?" Something like this. Ging heut Morgen übers Feld, Tau noch auf den Gräsern hing, sprach zu mir der lustige Fink, ein Guten Morgen, ein Geld, ach, ist es nicht ein schöner Welt, schöner Welt. So remember this tune, because it's not the last time that Mahler ever used it. In fact, Mahler reused his own music habitually and shamelessly. And I say shamelessly only because some other composers, notably Rossini, whom you'll hear about at the end of February, used their own music and were harshly criticized as being so terribly lazy. This is Rossini, who wrote 37 operas, right? So terribly lazy because they actually reused their own material. Whereas Mahler put it in a completely different light and said, really, all of my life is one gigantic work and should be treated as such. And he once said, no one can understand my 6th symphony until they know my first 5 symphonies intimately. Again, he has no lack of confidence about the value of what he has to offer, and never hesitates to use his own music. The fourth song and final song of this cycle, Lieder eines fahrenden Gesellen, is called the Two Blue Eyes. And he's singing about the two blue eyes of his beloved. Of course, those eyes have penetrated his heart, but caused him terrible suffering because she's gone, and now all he can do is sit under the linden tree as the blossoms shower down on him and remember that his life is unhappy and tragic. So he finds this wonderful musical motif to depict that. So that will come again too. Mahler discovers at this point a collection of German folk tales and poems set by Clemens Brentano and Achim von Arnim. Around, I think there are 2 sets of them, one in 1805 and one in 1808. And collectively these 2 sets, this anthology of German folk poetry, is called Des Knaben Wunderhorn, the youth's magic horn. These touch him, and he sets many of them to music. And they're wonderful songs about all kinds of different things. Some are happy, some are tragic. Mahler grew up, as I say, in this Czech bohemian environment, and there are lots of things he would have heard as a boy that someone growing up in a city might not have heard, or in another part of the world might not have heard. Gina and I once took a trip to well, it was then Czechoslovakia. And we were driving toward Prague, and we were in nowhere, you know, a town of 100. And suddenly, there's a funeral procession, and a brass band of easily 25 people, from tubas on up to trumpets and French horns, comes marching down the street with the coffin, and, you know, playing perfectly in tune and very solemnly. This tradition has not changed over hundreds of years. The brass band and the sound of the brass band is an integral part of rural Czech life. So Mahler heard this all the time. He heard Ländler all the time. You know, those dances I was telling you about, those 3/4 Bohemian peasant dances. He heard military calls all the time because Iglau was a garrison town. And so he would hear the reveille that got the soldiers up, he would hear the marches, and all of this music made an impression on his mind. So all of this music comes back in Des Knaben Wunderhorn, the Ländler, the military marches. And then, of course, we can't forget his morbid preoccupation with death. So lots of songs about soldiers, but some of them about dead soldiers who are singing to the live soldiers, and very Mahler-like themes. By now you can recognize this. So now I have a treat for you, because I'm just talking and talking. But later in life, when Mahler was 42, he actually married. And you probably know this part of his life story. He married Alma Schindler, who became Alma Mahler. And for the remaining 8 years of Mahler's life, they were married, but she had to make a tremendous sacrifice. She was 20 years, almost 20 years younger than Mahler, and a very gifted composer herself. But Mahler insisted, when they married, that she give up composition entirely, writing to her as if it was self-explanatory that she was to be his wife, not his colleague, and that her only duty henceforth would be to love him. And so Alma Mahler, a child of her generation, accepted these conditions, although, as you'll see when I tell her story more fully, she had another half-century to explore lots of other things about it. And so anyway, Gina and I do not have this arrangement, and so she has agreed to perform this evening, and we're going to do songs from Des Knaben Wunderhorn, illustrating different aspects of what Mahler weaves into his music. Now, she did agree to make the homemade cookies that are out there, so I guess we get the best of both worlds. Thank you. So Gina is going to come up, and we're going to do Earthly Life. This poem is a mother and a child. And the child says, "Mother, I'm hungry. Give me bread or I will die." And the mother says, "Wait, we have to bake it." And the child more desperately says, Mother, give me bread or I'll die immediately. I'm starving." And the mother says, "But we have to gather it." I think I'm doing this in the wrong order.
We have to
harvest it, gather it.
Then we have to gather it, then we have to bake it.
So it's a long process before this child is going to get fed. And if you understand German, you'll know the end.
Oh, you'll know the end. It's Mahler.
And it's Mahler, so you probably do.
Warte nur, mein liebes Kind.
by the early age when he wrote these songs, around 32, Mahler had experienced what it was like to be criticized in the press and by his teachers. And as I told you, he was very confident that he knew what he was doing and that other people simply weren't ready to understand him. So he was really drawn to this song about a cuckoo and a nightingale who decide to have a singing contest. The nightingale, of course, is a great singer, but is foolish enough to let the cuckoo choose the judge. And the cuckoo goes out and picks the donkey to be the judge of the song contest, because he says, after all, with such big ears, he must hear really well. So the nightingale sings, and it's beautiful, and then the cuckoo sings, and the donkey says, Nightingale, you did a good job, but, you know, it's kind of like American Idol. But Cuckoo, you really had counterpoint and rhythm, and I felt it down to my hoofs, and it was great. So the donkey declares the winner. This song is called In Praise of High Intellect. You have in these the essence of all the things that Mahler used. The only one that isn't a woman's song is that Mahler in this Knaben Wunderhorn wrote 4 songs about soldiers. And of course these are men's songs. And I told you there was one about a drummer who at the beginning of the song is alive and is singing, we leave the barracks at 3 or 4 in the morning and we march. And soon on in the song he's killed and he's lying dead on the ground looking up at his comrades and saying, why are you walking by me as though it were already over for me? And of course, the irony is that he's still at the end singing tra-la-lee, tra-la-la, you know. So Mahler is no stranger to irony. I'm going to just sing you a little of this song, but just to give you, because this kind of music also comes a lot in the symphonies. Almost grotesque irony permeates Mahler's music more and more as he gets older. And now he turns to write his first symphony. So he calls it the Titan, because, you know, what else? So the thing about the Titan is that nobody in 1888 had written a symphony so gigantic, so long, so many instruments required, 8 horns sitting in the section, as Gustav Mahler. So immediately, as a symphonist, he finds his feet using the largest orchestral palette that has ever been used. And this symphony begins with the falling fourth that Mahler was so fond of. As I say, Mahler's very confident, taking his time. So 3 minutes later, this falling fourth leads to another falling fourth. Well, that wasn't a fourth, because he got distracted and he remembers military bugle calls. Oh yes, I was doing falling fourths. But then, so Mahler does something very different from all symphonic predecessors. He starts off on one track, and then when something else occurs to him, he jumps to the other subject with no logical, musical connection. Now, that's not because he isn't a good composer, it's because he lives at a time when suddenly form is breaking down. And Mahler's head is, of course, full of all these different things, but he doesn't try to synthesize them into a classical form. He, in fact, tramples on tradition. His famous quotation, Tradition ist Schlamperei. Tradition is slovenliness. So tradition in and of itself for Mahler is not important. Expressing all the different ideas that occurred to him is important, and he said, famously, the symphony, he was friends with Sibelius. He actually said this to Sibelius. He said, the symphony is the world, and so the best symphony is the one which includes everything that is in the world. And as you see Mahler's symphonic output over the next 20 years, you'll see that he really held to that motto and tried to weave everything into these symphonies. All right, so now we've got this falling fourth, and guess what that makes him think of? That song he wrote in Lieder eines fahrenden Gesellen, Ging heute Morgen übers Feld, den Gräsern. Now this 3-minute song becomes a 20-minute symphony movement. And because Mahler, through all of his wonderful conducting and his orchestral experience, has truly become a master of the orchestra, he uses all the fantastic coloristic resources of a vast late 19th century symphony orchestra. So he really squeezes all that can be taken from this Ging heute Morgen übers Feld song, and it multiplies it in length 7 times, and that is the first movement of his Titan Symphony. Okay? Now, needless to say, not only does he use orchestral colors, but he visits strange harmonic regions, and he becomes mystical when all movement stops and there's just a tiny hovering vibrato in the highest strings, and strange sounds begin to happen. And as I told you, Mahler studied philosophy, so he felt that he was not only writing music, but paving the way for new philosophical thought. All right. In the second movement of the Titan Symphony, he explores the Ländler, not just the way he did in that simple song, Mai Tanz im Grünen, but symphonically. Unfortunately, I'm just playing a piano, so you don't really get all of the different things that are happening. But one of the things Mahler loves is to use wind instruments in the most irritating possible way. And he does this on purpose. So every time you hear something like that, you know that suddenly 12 or 16 wind instruments are all blowing on a dissonant chord, sometimes even with appoggiaturas and trills thrown in, just to make it sound really grating. And I don't know what he loved about this so much, but it is a characteristic in every orchestral piece of Mahler you will ever hear. Okay? The nickname in the orchestra for the E-flat clarinet is the weasel, because an E-flat clarinet, which sounds a fourth higher than the normal clarinet, sounds like a weasel being strangled to death. Composers, Mahler loved it, and then Richard Strauss decided to use it a lot. But Mahler was really the pioneer weasel user. And so these symphonies have this grating wind instrument quality that sounds, I think, like a plaintive voice, and that's why he loved it so much. Now, the third movement of this symphony, actually, we can all do this together. You all know Frère Jacques, right? Now, actually, in German, it's Bruder Martin, but we'll keep it in French, or you can sing La La La. So let's just have, this is group 1, this is group 2, this is group 3, this is group 4. We're going to just do Frère Jacques once, all right? Here you go. Frère Jacques, Frère Jacques. Now we're going to do it in the minor key, okay? Because this is smaller. Of this symphony starts with a it starts with a timpani, but then a double bass solo, unheard of in symphonic repertoire. A little variation. Playing 4-part harmony, sort of Frère Jacques, except in the minor key, until Mahler gets distracted and he says, wait a minute, we're missing the klezmer orchestra. You think I'm kidding? That's exactly what happens. Okay? This is so typical of everything that goes on for Mahler. And then we come back to Frère Jacques, and then we remember the two blue eyes at the end of Lieder eines fahrenden Gesellen, and the orchestra's playing. Right? Why waste a good tune once? So it comes back, and then a huge cymbal crash, and then this chord, which had never, I'm sure, ever been used before. C, G, C flat, D flat. The whole thing pounds off into F minor, where the symphony has never been before. So lots of things are happening that have never happened before. The finale of a symphony in a key totally unrelated to the key of the symphony. Chords that have never been used, rhythms that have never been used, instrumental colors that have never been used, and this gigantic finale, which like so many of Mahler's finales is a kind of apocalypse where things go to the extremes of chaos and then come back to something like tonality. So this symphony ends in heroic D major. And we're going to end this half of the program now. But I just want to say there are some more symphonies. So after you have wonderful come back. You know, this is a celebratory party, and because it's Mahler, we're celebrating his death instead of. But he died 100 years ago, in 1911. So this is a very appropriate time to be doing this. So Mahler, you know, he was composing this great symphony, but meanwhile, his ambitions as an opera conductor, and of course the need to earn a living, continued. So he moved from Kassel to Leipzig, to Hamburg, to Budapest, to Prague, and he was a big success, as I say, bringing in works from Italy and France that hadn't been heard in these places. But the real jewel in the opera conductor's crown was the Wiener Hofoper, the Vienna Imperial Opera. And Wagner knew that he could get that. Well, there was really one thing standing in his way. The head of the Hofoper was actually an imperial position. And to have an imperial position in Vienna, you had to be Catholic. So he converted. And he went back to some songs and stuck in little references to the Christ child and started writing pieces using Catholic mystical texts. And what the heck? He got the job. So now, Mahler is the head of the most important opera house in the world, conducting anywhere from 60 to 100 performances a year. So he's not a full-time composer. What he does is rent a little tiny cottage, and when I say tiny, I mean like 6 feet by 8 feet, by some lovely Austrian lake. Actually, there were a series of these little tiny composing cottages. And in the summer, when there's no opera, he takes 6 or 8 weeks and writes the Second Symphony, the Third Symphony, the Fourth Symphony. So he's really a weekend composer. And, you know, what a weekend composer. So during his time with the opera, he is conducting all the Wagner operas, all the Mozart operas that were done at the time, meaning, you know, Magic Flute, Figaro, and Don Giovanni over and over. But he was a great conductor, apparently, of Tristan and of Lohengrin and all the Ring. So, you know, he was much more famous in his lifetime as a conductor than as a composer. And as I say, he wasn't just a great conductor, he was a great administrator and a great politician and diplomat. When he was conducting in Budapest, there was a nationalist movement, and they wanted only Hungarian operas, Hungarian folk operas, you know. And so he said, great, how about the Ring cycle in Hungarian? He did it. He did it. Okay? They still use that translation in Budapest. And so then the next person that came in was so conservative and so Hungarian-minded that he had to leave. Actually, Mahler had to leave most of his positions. He never really left on his own free will, but there was always another better position to move to. And while he was imperial conductor of the Vienna Imperial Opera, he also became for some time the conductor of the Vienna Philharmonic, one of the greatest orchestras in the world. So he was busy. And as I say, he was healthy up to a certain moment. And then suddenly it became clear that he had some kind of infection in his blood. It was a streptococcal infection in his blood. So Mahler, who used to run up and down mountainsides and used this, in fact, as a technique to get many of his melodic inspirations, suddenly had to slow down a little bit. So he thought, I think I'll get married. And the person that he chose, it was a bad choice if he wanted to slow down, because he married one of the most vibrant, creative, dynamic people in all Vienna, and this was Alma Schindler, who was, as I mentioned, almost 20 years younger than he was for a start, but also one of Zemlinsky's composition students and knew all the great writers and painters. Vienna around 1900 was a really happening place. Think of just the painters like Gustav Klimt and Egon Schiele and Kokoschka and the architect Otto Bauer. I don't know if you've seen pictures of Vienna, this gigantic golden globe that looks like it has ivy growing out all over it. That is on a building called the Secession. And the Secession was a group of artists who all announced as a manifesto that they were going to secede from the traditional Viennese art establishment and create their own unique way of expressing themselves as artists. So that included musicians, painters, architects, writers. Schnitzler was part of this movement. So all of these people knew each other and, of course, had coffee together all the time. And so this was a constant laboratory of creating new ideas. And so Mahler was right in the thick of this. And Alma Schindler, now Alma Mahler, was in the thick of it too. But she did give up her composing. She, however, never gave up her numerous liaisons with all these wonderful other artistic people, and she viewed herself as a muse in every sense for all of these guys. So she saw no problem with this. Mahler did, of course, but he couldn't keep up with her, so he really had no control over the situation. And while Alma Mahler was having affairs all the time, she nevertheless stayed married to Mahler, and they had two children. Maria and Anna. Maria is the older child. Both so dear to both parents. And then Mahler finds a set of poems by Rückert, 428 poems on the death of children. And they're great songs, but what can I say? So he writes 5 songs on the death of children, and then his older daughter dies of scarlet fever, and his wife never forgave him because she felt that he somehow was able to create that. And it's not even surprising she thought that, because Mahler was always saying that he was creating the universe and that he had a hotline to God, and so Mahler shouldn't have written those songs. But nevertheless, he went on composing in every spare minute, conducting furiously, and not just in Vienna, but guest appearances all over, administering as well as conducting, and keeping the highest standards of the orchestra and the chorus, everything. So now, of course, he's still writing symphonies. He'd written this gigantic 4-movement symphony. And remember that when he had staged his own death with all the candles, that gigantic Totenfeier had come to him, the death rites. So he resurrected that movement, and in fact created a whole 5-movement symphony called the Resurrection. So the Resurrection Symphony leaves the first symphony in the dust in terms of forces required and length. a nice 85-minute symphony that calls for 10 trumpets and 10 horns and, 70 or 80 string players and oh, I forgot to mention, now we're adding soloists and a gigantic chorus. So there's 200 people on stage, and it is truly a magnificent piece. There's no question that any performance of Mahler's Second Symphony leaves everybody in the audience truly inspired and uplifted. It is a great work of music and a great work of art. It begins with this and Mahler's favorite, falling fourth, right? This chord comes in Mahler, I can't tell you how often. Wagner had thought of it first, but Mahler really made it his own. And this will come over and over throughout the symphonies. All right, so obviously I can't give you a huge overview of all of Mahler's symphonies, but the Second Symphony also has one of these crazy, diabolical, grotesque scherzos, and then it takes another one of the Knaben Wunderhorn songs. One of the Knaben Wunderhorn poems is about a preacher who isn't having much luck with human congregations, so he goes to preach to the fish. And all the fish, the carp and the eels, come to listen to him, and then at the end, the fish have remained unchanged by all the wonderful information they've received, so they say, we really like that preacher, he's a good one. And the music went like... So again, Mahler takes this 3-minute song and turns it into a 12-minute symphonic movement using the weasel, of course, and all the other orchestral colors that he can devise. And so there's this fantastic variation on the fish preacher song. And then he goes to a song actually in the symphony. He takes another Knaben Wunderhorn poem. This was such an influential work. And it's humans lie in great need and pain. I want to become an angel. So this movement is just a solo, a contralto, an alto solo. And very heavy on the brass instruments. The same kind of chorale that we heard in the streets near Prague that Bruckner actually developed, Mahler uses as the accompaniment for this song about moving from death to life. And then, in the final movement, the 5th movement, we've moved into 5-movement symphonies now too. Nobody had been, well, Pastoral Symphony has 5 movements, but that's sort of compressed. This is 5 big movements. And the 5th movement says, the judgment day comes, the graves open and all the dead come forth, and there is no right and wrong, and there is no judgment, and everyone is uplifted. Auferstehen, be resurrected. So this is this fantastic triumphant ending that Mahler devises for his Second Symphony. Now what can you do when you've written an 85-minute symphony with 5 movements? Well, you write a 3rd symphony that lasts about 100 minutes and has 6 movements. And that is exactly what Mahler did, okay? So the 3rd symphony begins, and of course with a large chorus and soloists, and a boys' chorus thrown in. This symphony begins with all 8 French horns playing a melody together. Justice to 8 French horns. There is nothing that you can say about the visceral power of these Mahler symphonies with such huge forces. But the reason it's worthwhile to do this little overview is that you don't have a chance to hear Mahler symphonies live that often. But there are certainly lots of wonderful recordings, and with computers, those are all, you don't even have to get the recording, it's all right there. So if you're listening to a Mahler symphony, you'll have certain characteristics now that you'll know to look for. The grotesque trilling in the woodwind instruments, and the chorales that sound like Bruckner, and the almost hysterical prominence of a single instrument vaulting over all the rest, rather than a smooth texture. Mahler purposely avoids smooth texture in many parts of his symphonies. And then, when, at the end, there's a resolution when he depicts the universe as a calm, beautiful place, the contrast is even stronger. So there are certain things you're going to hear over and over in Mahler symphonies. The Ländler, those peasant dances turned into symphonic movements. And of course, quotations from his songs, and even quotations from other movements of his own symphonies. All right, so we're thinking about this third symphony, and really, Mahler envisions this symphony as a joyful symphony, ultimately a triumphant symphony, and a symphony that pays homage to nature. He called it, each movement had a name like what the birds tell me, what the forests tell me, and the final movement is what love tells me. And he had actually written a seventh movement, which was another song called Wir genießen die himmlischen Freuden, which means we enjoy the pleasures of heaven. But he took that song out, because I guess he thought 100 minutes was enough for one symphony. When you hear this symphony, of course, it's going to be broken up, because the audience isn't expected to sit for 100 minutes without getting up. So the conductor has to decide, how to break this work up. When is the intermission going to happen? So perhaps for this reason, Mahler decided for his fourth symphony, instead of writing something that was 2 hours and 10 movements, that he would actually write a shorter work. And Mahler's fourth symphony is, for him, his most quiet, concise, gentle piece. It's only 50 minutes long. He goes back to only 4 movements, and the fourth movement is what had formerly been the seventh movement of the third symphony, this song. Wir genießen die himmlischen Freuden. An angelic soprano sings about how heaven is just like earth, except with all of the suffering and pain removed. Saint Martha is baking the bread, and everything is happening just like on earth, but this time we can enjoy it. So that, you can imagine, for Mahler was a very important poem. And the fourth symphony is perhaps one of Mahler's most frequently played pieces, not least of all because it's the only symphony among the 9 fully composed symphonies that can be done by a normal-sized orchestra. You don't have to hire 45 extra players in order to put it on. So the fourth symphony is calm and beautiful and makes way for Mahler's fifth symphony. Now, this fifth symphony is characteristic in every way of what we've come to expect of Mahler. It begins with a military call. Remember, he grew up near that garrison, had it in his head. But then moves into a funeral march. This funeral march quickly becomes more impassioned, and the first movement of the fifth symphony is really a gigantic, tragic statement. However, later on in this symphony, in the fourth movement, Mahler does something which, as his life moves on, he does more and more, and that is create a movement of ethereal calm and beauty. This is just harp and strings. Of Mahler's slow, beautiful songs. And the fifth movement, actually, is triumphant and an exercise in very complex counterpoint. Counterpoint in music is using many melodic themes simultaneously in such a way that they fit with each other harmonically. Obviously, Bach used counterpoint all the time, but for late 19th century composers, counterpoint was something which features only more rarely in their music, certainly in the extreme way that it does in this finale of the Fifth Symphony. Another example that comes to mind is the overture to Wagner's opera Die Meistersinger, which is counterpoint on parade, I think one critic called it somewhat unkindly. It's fantastic because all of the different themes can come together at once. And so if Mahler, as he said, was trying to show the universe or show the world, it's a great effect to have all the different moods and tunes happening at once, just the way they do if we could hear all of us as a melody at the same time and we fit together. Now, the Sixth Symphony, which Mahler himself called his tragic symphony, is tragic in the sense that Mahler felt all of life is movement from one place to another. And the tragedy is when fate obliges us to stay in the same place. We're unable to move. So the Sixth Symphony never moves from the key of A minor in 3 of its 4 movements. And this, for Mahler, symbolized the tragedy of a person who is unable to move. So we hear the first. So we're in A minor, very clearly A minor, and in the second subject of the movement, we hear something much more beautiful. And Alma Mahler, in her biography of her husband, said, "That was me." She said that always, even in the middle of the most desperate thoughts, my husband would return to joy that was inspired by me. So that's Alma, by her own admission. And then in the second movement, Mahler is back into A minor. But it's one of those 1, 2, 3 grotesque scherzo things. But suddenly in the middle of it, we hear something like this on one of those shrill wind instruments. And it'll come later in other instruments. This is a theme that he'll use transformed later on in the movement, but something sinister that cannot be shaken away. All right, the third movement of this is a beautiful adagio, and actually when Mahler first wrote the symphony, the movements were switched around. And even now people will exchange the positions of the second and third movements of the symphony. You probably heard this. Unusual is that this goes back to klezmer music that Mahler heard even in the flatting that second degree of the scale gives a feeling of so. Even in a simple melody, Mahler twists that note so that it has a different emotional feeling from something that was played in a diatonic major key. And then the finale of the symphony comes back to A minor, and in case we didn't know that fate had intervened, there are 3 gigantic hammer blows that, you know, when Beethoven wrote the 5th Symphony, he said famously, "This is fate knocking at the door." But he just used the regular symphonic orchestra, and that whole movement only takes 7 minutes. So Mahler expands on this principle, and the movement takes over 20 minutes, and fate knocks at the door with a gigantic 12-pound hammer that the percussionist has to lift way up. It's a whole different way. The 7th Symphony is probably the most obscure of all the Mahler symphonies, and perhaps the least frequently performed. A wonderful piece. It opens with an unusual interval. Really? All right, this is another theory. You can take it or not. But Mahler's 6th Symphony starts with the 6th, right? The interval of a 6th. And keeps coming back to the interval of a 6th as the prominent intervals. Well, the 7th Symphony, coincidentally or not, has this very prominent interval of a 7th that becomes the motif for the entire gigantic first movement. So I don't know if that was unconscious. I'm sure it was unconscious. But in any case, the 6th Symphony is dominated by 6ths, and the 7th Symphony is dominated by 7ths. The 7th Symphony has 5 movements. The 2nd and 4th are both night music, different kinds of night music, but this is sometimes called the Night Symphony. And the 5th movement is one of these very bizarre, apocalyptic movements that Mahler was so fond of. None of these pieces were gaining great appeal, and Mahler's tenure at the Hofoper was wearing thin, because although he was doing extraordinary things, he no longer had the physical strength because of this infection in his blood to do what he had done before. He couldn't work 18 hours a day and rehearse the chorus and rehearse the orchestra and compose and have his life at home. So he took a job that was offered to him at the Metropolitan Opera in New York. And in 1907, he and Alma moved to New York. But it didn't turn out to be such a wonderful partnership after a little while, because although he brought lots of works to New York that the Metropolitan Opera hadn't heard, they found his own music somewhat strange, and somehow the board of directors of the Metropolitan felt that one contract was enough for Gustav Mahler. So he took a job with the New York Philharmonic. They were right there. And that also was sort of a mixed success. But by 1910, this disease had progressed to the point where it was clear that he had lesions in his heart. And he was not quite 50. And so he said, I want to go back to Vienna. And the last works that he wrote, one of them was a very extroverted, outgoing piece, his 8th Symphony. And finally, Mahler enjoyed in 1910 the thrill of seeing one of his own works be a success with the public. This 8th symphony has more vocal writing in it than any of the other symphonies. He uses a chorus and 8 soloists, actually 2 choruses and 8 soloists from beginning to end. The first half, this gigantic first movement, is Veni Creator Spiritus, Come Creative Spirit, and it's a Catholic mystical poem from the 10th century. And then the second half of the gigantic 8th symphony is from Goethe's Faust, Part 2. So he juxtaposes these 2 halves, the first in Latin, second in German, and lo and behold, at the end of this, the most people, even Mahler, has ever put on a stage. The symphony was even nicknamed the Symphony of 1,000. The whole audience just went crazy, and everybody loved this piece. I mean, Mahler must have been so happy, because every other piece he wrote, he had to make excuses and say, it's only in another 50 years that people will be ready to understand this music. And seemingly, he had written something that everybody understood and loved, and the ovation went on for half an hour. So he must have just been so happy. The last 3 works of his life are all mystical and reflective. The 9th Symphony is a gorgeous thing, but Mahler didn't really want to write a 9th Symphony because he knew once Beethoven had written a 9th Symphony, it was curtains for Beethoven, and Bruckner hadn't been able to get past number 9, so he was very superstitious about writing a 9th Symphony. Before he wrote the 9th Symphony, he wrote something called Das Lied von der Erde, the Song of the Earth, which is 6 songs taken from Chinese poetry, and the symphonic interludes are as long as the songs themselves, so that it's really sometimes called a song symphony. But it was Mahler's way of trying to escape fate and not write a 9th Symphony. Well, you can't escape fate, and especially not if you're Gustav Mahler. So he did write that 9th Symphony, and in it, quotations from his own Kindertotenlieder, the songs on the death of children, because he knew that it was his time. So the symphony begins already as a calm and resigned farewell to all the beauties of life. And if you ever have a chance to hear a wonderful performance of the 9th Symphony, I recommend you take advantage of it, because you won't have the chance very often. But it is truly one of the most beautiful things that a human being has ever written. He did start a 10th Symphony, but was only able to sketch it and pretty much filled out 2 of its 5 movements. In 1960, for the 100th anniversary of Mahler's birth, a British composer and musicologist named Derek Cook took all the sketches and created what he called a performing version of Mahler's 10th Symphony. And it was broadcast on BBC, and Alma Mahler, who heard it, got in contact with Derek Cook. She was still alive in 1960, and said, I didn't realize there was so much Mahler in this. Because all she knew was that her husband had left some sketches, and that she was alive 50 years after his death to hear the first realized version of this 10th Symphony, and still totally with it. Oh, by the way, at the end of his life, Mahler said, I'm sorry I told you to stop composing. You're really very good. You should go back and do it. But she didn't really. But she did have an affair with Kokoschka, and then a marriage, not very long, with Walter Gropius, the architect, the Bauhaus fellow. And then after he was gone, she took up with Franz Werfel, and they were married for quite a long time. So really, she was intimately associated with some of the greatest figures of late 19th century and early 20th century Vienna. And she didn't die until 1964. I remember that there was a singer, well, there still is, a man named Tom Lehrer, who wrote, okay, have you all heard his ode to, Alma, tell us, all modern women are jealous. You didn't even use pawns, yet you got Gustav and Walter and Franz. So she was immortalized in song by more than one composer. So Gustav Mahler left this legacy, which was very confusing to the world. And between 1911, when he died at the age of 50, didn't reach his 51st birthday, and 1960, when the 100th anniversary of his birth came around, he was quite neglected. There were a few who performed his works. When his first symphony was premiered, there was a young conductor, aged 18 in the audience, named Bruno Schlesinger, who loved this piece and became a great champion of Mahler's works and changed his name to Bruno Walter. So he recorded all of the Mahler symphonies and all of the Mahler songs, and that is our direct link to Mahler. A little later, when Mahler was conducting his second symphony, there was offstage brass, and he had to hire some little whippersnapper to do that. And he ran backstage because this little guy had done such a fantastic job, and it was Otto Klemperer. So Klemperer also became a huge champion of Mahler's works, as did the British conductor John Barbaroli and the Dutch conductor Willem Mengelberg. So there were a few conductors, but really only in the last 50 years have we suddenly been exposed to Mahler. And I think psychologically, Mahler is modern and was ahead of his time. Britten and Shostakovich both said we owe a tremendous debt to Mahler above all other composers. So there was an incident that was really interesting. In 1910, Mahler's marriage was not falling apart because they stayed together, but the death of Maria, the older daughter, and the fact that Mahler knew that while he was writing the Eighth Symphony, Alma was off cavorting with Walter Gropius already. It was a rough time. And somebody said, I know somebody that you can talk to. So Mahler wound up having a 4-hour walk in Leiden, Holland with Sigmund Freud. No kidding. And they talked about many things, of course, death and love and marriage, and Freud said, we are very similar. And Freud really hit the nail on the head. He said, we are both narcissists with obsessive tendencies and layers of hysteria. I mean, right there. But he penetrated something in Mahler, and he said, why do you feel you're not as great as Beethoven or Bach? And Mahler said, because I have never been able to pursue a musical idea without some other completely unrelated and often trivial musical idea intruding on that musical idea. And as they talked, Mahler said, aha! Just what you want to happen when you're with the father of psychoanalysis. He says, aha! When I was young, I had suppressed this memory until now, but I was witnessing my father beating my mother, and I had to get out of the house. The scene was so horrific. And I walked out into the street, and there was an organ grinder playing a hurdy-gurdy. In fact, he was playing, Ach, mein lieber Augustin, Augustin, Augustin. And he said, from that moment on, I have never been able to separate the truly tragic from the trivial, because they coexist. So Freud, in a sense, gave him this key that a childhood experience indeed had affected his composition. However, do we know in 2011 if Mahler had never had that experience and had not composed in this extremely quirky way when one idea on one plane seemed to lead to something completely unrelated, if he would have had the musical influence that he has today? A question which we can't really answer, but in a way, the pathology led to the greatness and led to the music which now is played all over the world quite regularly. So I thought it was fascinating that Mahler and Freud had the chance to meet, and I don't think that Freud cared much for music. He said as much. He'd gone to the opera a few times, but he didn't remember if Mahler was conducting or not. That must have been hard for Mahler to hear. But in any case, they did connect, and Freud was 4 years older than Mahler, but the two of them at the very end of Mahler's life formed this bond. So there are 100 things we could talk about, but this is becoming like a Mahler symphony. So yes, let's
But the one story you have to tell is Gropius asking Mahler for Alma's hand in marriage because he thought that Mahler was her father.
I know. Gropius thought that Mahler was Alma's father because he was almost 20 years older and asked for her hand in marriage. That didn't go over really well. My other, well, go ahead, please.
What do you think of the Kaplan recording of the Resurrection?
It's great. So Gilbert Kaplan is not a conductor. He's a businessman, and a successful businessman, successful enough to rent the London Symphony. And so he did, and he recorded the Second Symphony. And you know what? Maybe Barbaroli did some things better, and maybe Bruno Walter understood it more deeply. But I think the man really knew the piece and brought a lot out of it. Interestingly, I think, with a composer like Mahler, a personal interpretation can be more valuable than in a Mozart symphony. You know, we've heard people take Mozart symphonies and try to impress their personal stamp on them, usually with unsuccessful results. But in the case of Mahler, who valued subjectivity so highly, I think the case for Gilbert Kaplan or you know, a very skilled amateur like Gilbert Kaplan conducting a Mahler symphony has a lot of validity. So, you know, there are a lot of recordings of all these symphonies you can listen to. Yes?
We had heard a lecture about the ninth, that it was a record of Mahler's soon-to-be heart attack, and that he begins with his death and ends with his funeral march. Is that true?
Ends with his, yes, ends with his farewell, really. But yes, his funeral march. And this is theory number 3 for the night, okay? All discountable. But as Mahler gets older and his heart begins to become less reliable, he thinks more and more that the pentatonic scale feels to him somehow like his own irregular heartbeat. And this harp in the Ninth Symphony. We're in D major, by the way. And he keeps having this little palpitation. So I think that's very accurate. Mahler was nothing if not autobiographical. And even though he tried to say, nothing in my music is programmatic, there's no question that he felt his music, you know, spoke for him. But as Alma Mahler said while he was writing on the Ninth Symphony, Gustav is on the telephone with God all the time now. She was sort of irritated. Yes?
What is your favorite? Is there one piece in Mahler that you're just passionate about?
I think the Sixth Symphony as a whole is my personal favorite. But it's all pretty fabulous. And you know, it's funny because he took one thing from another. If you could play all the Mahler symphonies end to end and throw in the songs, it would take, you know, 20 hours max, maybe 18 hours. So it's not a gigantic output. And it would be, you know, but it's hardly longer than the whole Ring to listen to everything that Mahler wrote. And in some ways, you can go from one piece to another. It's so unlike Beethoven, where a single symphony or a single sonata is about one thing and explores it thoroughly, and then it's finished. Mahler is never really finished. And his farewell pieces, like Ich bin der Welt abhanden gekommen, they really suggest that they would go on forever if we both had the time. You know? Yes?
I wonder if you had a chance to hear the Lied von der Erde with Susan Graham.
Yes!
I thought it was a
In the Schoenberg. So Arnold Schoenberg loved Mahler and his music. They had a tremendous respect for each other. And Schoenberg had started a society where people would meet in living rooms because he felt that the standard of large orchestral playing wasn't very high. And with chamber groups, he could demand many more rehearsals and perform things accurately, and of course more frequently. So many of Mahler's works, along with other composers, underwent this treatment. And so there's this fantastic chamber version of Das Lied von der Erde, and
It
Pro
was
Musica
really,
did it here
really
recently. It's
wonderful.
brilliant, yeah. So these all exist. And, for example, Zemlinsky wrote four-hand versions of Mahler symphonies for home consumption, just the way Mahler and his friend had written a home version of Bruckner's Third Symphony. So there were excellent reductions of these gigantic works made by the first-rate musicians of the time. And I think that's a good place to go.